This video, Easter is just a few weeks away, and of course, with that, every year comes the talk of conspiracy theories about Jesus and his followers, talk of other supposed dying and rising gods, and of course, claims are made every year that Christianity is simply a copycat of other pagan religions. And honestly, on the surface, sometimes these claims sound very concerning and even convincing at times. But we're going to dissect some of these issues today with our guest Alan D. Donato in his new book, The Mithraic Origins of Christianity, Questioning the Mithras-Christ Connection. I'm Adam Tucker with Southern Evangelical Seminary, and this is Why Do You Believe? Welcome back to another episode of Why Do You Believe? I appreciate you joining us. Thank you for being with us and sticking with us. I hope you're enjoying the weekly content, and I would encourage you to check out last week's episode specifically with Dr. Fuz Rana from Reasons to Believe as we discussed the COVID-19 vaccine and God's providence, actually. So it was very enlightening for me. I had a lot of my own questions answered. So if you have any questions and concerns about the COVID-19 vaccines, I would encourage you to check that out. And as always, you can find the video on our YouTube channel, on our Facebook page. You can find the audio for the episode on our podcast, which is available wherever you find your podcast, as well as the SES mobile app. So I would encourage you to subscribe to our YouTube channel, like this video, like our Facebook page, click the bell so you know when we're going live, so you can keep up with everything that we're doing. So if you have been following us, then you know that we like to start our show with a fallacy of the week. Again, a fallacy is just a bad way of thinking or a bad way of arguing. So we want to have our fallacy of the week at the moment. This week's is a little difficult because of something we all struggle with, probably more so than some of the others. This week's fallacy of the week is confirmation bias. Confirmation bias. And that is simply when someone interprets new evidence as confirmation of their pre-existing beliefs or ideas. So whatever new evidence comes along, whatever they're told, that just somehow fits into what they already think. This is exactly how social media algorithms work. We are constantly fed a diet of ideas that we already agree with. So our view of reality and our view of issues often become very pigeonholed if all we're relying on are YouTube videos or Facebook posts, because we're just being fed the things that we're already trafficking in, and usually those are things that we agree with. This is what's happening in our culture right now with racism specifically. White supremacy right now is the hot button thing, where everything that happens is somehow forced into this idea of systemic racism or white supremacy or whatever the case may be. Are those issues involved in some of the cases that are going on or tragedies that are occurring? Possibly. That needs to be investigated for sure, but that does not necessarily mean that is the case every single time that happens. Often it is a case of confirmation bias. Christians and atheists alike can easily be guilty of this particular fallacy, where nothing that is said, no new discovery can change someone's mind, or every new discovery fits in with their pre-existing ideas. And again, that can be the case for Christians or atheists or any other worldview as far as that goes. So confirmation bias, something we need to be on the lookout for, something we need to guard against in our own thinking, so that we can be better thinkers and honor God with our whole beings, including our minds. All right, so let me switch shots here. I'm going to bring in our guest for the day. SCS alum and a friend of mine, and probably the biggest Batman fan that I know, Alan D. Donato. Alan, thank you for joining us, man.
Thanks for having me, Adam. I almost wore a Batman shirt too. My
I
wife
thought you
stopped me.
would. I was hoping you would, actually. I
No, my wife made me change.
I just watched the new Snyder Cut of Justice League last night, so I was thinking
Did
about
you?
you as I was watching Batman on there.
Okay, well, later you're gonna have to tell me a little bit about it. I haven't watched it yet, but I'm looking forward to it.
And I am neither endorsing the movie nor telling people not to watch it. I'm just stating a fact that I saw it last
Yeah.
night, and you can judge me if you would like. Alrighty. Well, Alan, we like to have a little fun with our guests and learn a little bit about them before we get started. And of course, as we learned in our Fallacy of the Week a few weeks ago, all of the questions I'm about to ask you are really fallacies because I'm presenting an either or case, and there are many more options. But we
Right.
just like to play a little game we call On the Contrary. All right, so I've got 60 seconds on the clock here, and I'm
Okay.
going to ask you some either or questions, and we'll see what Alan is all about. All right, you ready?
Oh boy, yeah.
All right, here we go. Pecan or pecan?
Pecan,
Okay, good.
I
All right,
think.
all right. Pepsi or Coke?
Pepsi.
Oh, interesting, interesting.
I
Hot
don't usually
weather or
drink
cold
either
weather?
one though.
What's that? You don't drink either
I
one?
generally don't drink either one, but
And that's why you're very healthy. Hot weather or cold weather?
hot weather, definitely.
Hot weather. Okay. Well,
Yeah.
your season is
In the right
coming then.
place. Yes, I'm looking forward to it.
Phone calls or emails?
Emails.
I'm right there with
Depends
you
on
with
who the person is. Depends on who the person is.
that. Dogs
Sometimes
or
it's
cats?
FaceTime if it's, somebody that's
That's
really
true.
like.
That's true. Yeah, I need to add that one in there. Dogs or cats?
Oh, dogs.
Okay. You
Again,
have
I
a
don't have either one. No,
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 neither
no.
one.
Not a pet person.
dog? And printed books or ebooks?
Printed books, but I have a ton that are electronic just because, the bookshelf fills up so quick.
Yeah, yeah. Yep. Printed books are definitely winning out with our guests so far. Now, of course, I'm not
I'm
really
not
surprised
surprised.
by that, but
Yeah, me either.
I like ebooks myself just for the ease of searching and highlighting and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah, if I'm going to travel too, I'll take like my
Yeah,
whole collection with me. So
for sure. Yeah, you got your whole library right there in your pocket, essentially.
yeah, convenience. Love it.
That's right. Well, thank you for playing along with us and letting us learn a little bit more about you.
I
And
thought you were going to ask me something like Marvel or DC.
well, no, we know the answer to that one, or I know the answer to that one. It's always going to be DC all day long for you, right?
Yeah, I'm afraid so.
What have you checked out the new Superman show yet? I'm curious.
No, actually, I have not.
It's
Is it
interesting.
good?
It's an
Okay.
interesting concept. Yeah, yeah. You have to check that one out.
Yeah, I'll have to do that.
All right. Well, let's jump into the topic for the day. So,
All right.
I remember it's been goodness probably 10 years ago now when it seemed like this particular copycat religion issue was really kind of a hot button thing at the moment. And I remember a friend of mine actually, who was a relatively strong believer, sent me an email one day out of the blue. I had not seen them in a while. They'd moved away. And they had stumbled across this internet sensation of a film called Zeitgeist. And it rocked their world. They were literally on the verge of abandoning Christianity because of this internet viral video that supposedly
seen the
gave
film.
all of this information about Christianity being a copycat religion. You remember that?
Oh yeah. It was
Yeah,
huge.
It was for quite a while actually. It was
Yeah.
a big deal. So for a long time, you've been my go-to guy for questions about this issue of Christianity being a copycat of pagan myths, so to speak. And so you decided to write a book about it, and it's called The Mithraic Origins of Christianity, Questioning the Mithras Christ Connection. So why did you write the book? What's your main goal behind that?
Well, the book is actually just a very narrow treatment of the topic. When you talk about Jesus myth, copycat myth, that kind of stuff, the topic's much broader than what I was covering actually in that book. So I was covering just one particular mystery cult, which is brought up in a lot of those things. I know Zeitgeist brings it up. I know Bill Maher brings it up in his movie, what is it, Religulous? So it's the Mithraic cult that I was dealing with in particular, because there's a lot of accusations that the cult of Mithras was really inspirational for early Christians. That the early Christians got a lot of their stuff from the Mithraic cult, including the story of Jesus. The parallels are always brought out. And when you bring up, Zeitgeist and, maybe a decade or more ago now, I think it's closer to about 20 years, to tell you the truth, since that movie came out. But, that's not even something that was just popular then. This is something that I was dealing with when I was a student way back, in the late 80s in college as an undergraduate, taking my first, college level mythology course and listening to all the kind of stuff that's brought out that are parallels between Christianity, the New Testament, and different pagan gods. So I wrestled with that a lot back then, which is really probably the first time I started to get interested in the topic and do more and more research on it. But anyways, the book is dealing with just one mystery out of a lot of them. And you have similar accusations that are made about the story of Christianity. So again, some of the basic claims that you'll hear over and over again is, Jesus was born on December 25th. December 25th is one of those dates that is associated with the pagan sun god, particularly the god Mithras, which is the focus again of my book. But you also have the idea that, Mithras and these other gods had, virgin birth, that they died and resurrected, that they had, 12 disciples, and all these types of things over and over again. The same pattern emerges. And I wanted to do an investigation of Mithras in particular, because that was the one that seemed to be coming up the most and had the most direct parallels as far as some of the sources out there. And the sparse amount of information that we actually have from the cult really doesn't give us anything like that. So the two basic things that I covered in the book, and it's not a very long book, but I wanted to talk about the chronology, the relationship between the cult itself and Christianity as to which one came on the scene first. And then I also wanted to deal with the actual evidence that we have for the myth of Mithras versus the story of Christ, and look at, what kind of parallels actually exist. Because, and we end up seeing over and over again is that all of these stories, Zeitgeist, whoever's bringing out these parallels, really tend to exaggerate the parallels. I mean, the parallels are not really as strong as people might think they are. And then where you do have parallels, and I will admit there are parallels between what you see in the story of Jesus and in the New Testament and the Bible in general with things we find in pagan mythology, but you don't necessarily need to posit some kind of copying to account for those parallels. And that's a whole other topic, which I think might be interesting to get into. The idea that the parallels are somehow some kind of sufficient condition for proving copying. Right. If anything, it goes the other way, right? A copying would definitely be sufficient for producing parallels, but parallels are at best a necessary condition. And you can account for the parallels in a lot of different ways. And I think some modern mythology scholars and scholars even outside the world of mythology in general have dealt with these types of things. So if that's something that we want to go into, I'd be happy to talk a little bit about that, because I think that's more important than just, one particular cult, because you can deal with Mithras all day, which I did in the book, but, somebody might come along and say, well, what about Osiris? Or what about Adonis or Attis or Dionysus? I mean, there's all these other characters that you could bring in as well.
Yeah. So how did this whole line of thinking of Christianity being a copycat religion, how did it even get started? What are its roots?
Hard to say. I mean, obviously Christianity arose in the pagan Roman Empire. So you had interaction with pagan mythology from the very beginning. And a lot of the early apologists, Justin Martyr, and, people that followed were already dealing with these types of accusations way back then, right? Talking 2nd century on forward. When you get to, the Middle Ages, you still have people reflecting back on things like Christmas, the idea of borrowing from a pagan holiday became a big issue for a while, especially when you get into the 17th, 18th centuries. That was, a pretty big thing. And then really in the 19th century, one guy that I came across, and I actually came across this through interaction with a lot of the Jehovah's Witnesses. One of them gave me a book at one point called The Two Babylons by Alexander Hislop, who was a bishop back in the 1800s. And his work, you'll end up seeing, had a huge impact on a lot of the thinking today. It was an attack on Christianity and the Roman Catholic Church in particular, dealing with the pagan origins of all the types of things that you find in the Bible. So he did a really, shoddy job when you really look at it. Most people today reject most of the things that he said, but I think that's where the big influence came. And again, 20th century's just been building on that stuff since.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned a few of the claims, like December 25th and those kind of things. What really are the big important claims that are made that Christianity supposedly copied, and why do they think? How do they try to support that accusation?
December 25th is probably not the biggest claim, right? I think Christians have a great answer for that. The date itself, we know we
Sure.
Probably didn't have anything to do with the actual birth of Christ, but
Right.
Historically, it's also interesting that it does seem to be a date that Christians had already attached themselves to prior to it really being attached to a god like Mithras, because Mithras and his attachment to the date comes much, much later, after the attachment of the god Sol Invictus in the Roman Empire, which would be in the late 3rd century. When you have that cult officially adopted by Rome and attached to the date to December 25th, seems to be very possibly the Romans trying to identify their cult on a particular that the Christians were already recognizing, because you can go all the way back to Irenaeus and find references to kind of the dating of certain events in the life of Christ. And we can get into that too if you want, but again, that might take us down a different path. But it does tie into Easter, interestingly, so maybe we'll come back to that. But as far as the big claims that Christians need to deal with, the virgin birth one is, I guess I put that up near the top only because you tend to think of virgin birth, death, and resurrection. The immediate figure that comes to mind is Jesus nowadays. But you do have that same claim made by for a whole bunch of different gods. Okay, so get my little tongue-tied, but so I already mentioned a few of them, like Osiris, right? Dies, rises again, if you want to call it a resurrection. It technically is a type of resurrection. So I hear some Christian apologists that actually will dismiss a lot of these stories as not parallels at all or completely concocted. And I don't ever want to go that far, because I think there are parallels. And it's not actually just in the realm of some of these dying and rising God myths. You also see this kind of stuff in the whole area of what might be known as hero myth. So you could even bring in characters like Hercules, Aeneas, a lot of figures that you'll find in Greek, Roman mythology, and in mythology beyond that. Gilgamesh. You can have all these stories, and there are lots of parallels between these heroes and the life of Christ as well. So when I teach my mythology class, I tend to focus a lot on hero myths and talk about some of these patterns that emerge. And the patterns are actually really interesting. But again, I don't think they're an attack necessarily on the historicity of the Gospels, right? The historicity of Jesus, his life, death, and that kind of stuff. The parallels, I think most of my students can probably pick up on pretty quickly. I don't tend to emphasize that, here's, Jesus and here's his other gods, and try to reconcile that issue. That's really not what I do in the class. It's presenting the stories. But I think those are the big ones. I think the death and resurrection, again, since it's about Easter time, that's going to be probably the most important one, because that's the most important aspect, right, of the earthly ministry and work of Christ.
Yeah, yeah. So if there are these apparent parallels and other dying and rising God stories and these types of hero myths, why should we not be concerned that Jesus is just another one of these hero myths?
Well, one way to address the topic is to really ask yourself where these parallels might come from, if it's not copying, because historically there have been two basic ways people have dealt with the parallels. It's either due to some kind of cultural borrowing, some kind of diffusion where these stories spread out from some source and then other cultures pick them up and elaborate on them, or it might have something to do with the way that we approach reality, maybe something that is inherent in the way human beings think. One of the big theologians in the 20th century that was dealing with the issue of mythology and Christianity was Rudolf Bultmann. And one of the literary debates that he had, there was another German scholar, Helmut Thielke, who talks about the possibility that myth can't be completely divorced from human thought, that it might be some kind of essential element in human thought. And he thinks of it as possibly just as legitimate a way to approach reality as that of natural science. And other people have come up with this type of thinking as well. So if you're familiar with the Freudians, Jungians, Sigmund Freud brings out this idea of the individual unconsciousness. His student Otto Rank talks about the fact that there's this uniformity in myth across the world that seems to be related to some kind of uniform disposition of the human mind. I think the biggest influence would be Carl Jung, who was also, a student of Freud's, though he split away from him and introduced a new concept, which was the concept of the collective unconscious. Right. So it's not some kind of individual thing alone. He believed in an individual unconsciousness, but there was also this collective idea. And I think this was really important because there are lots of stories. If you look at world mythology in general, from cultures all around the world in all different time periods, whether it's ancient Egypt, Mesoamerica, Norse tradition, Greek, Roman, Chinese, doesn't matter where you go, you're going to find the same patterns, the same images, the same characters, in some sense, the same story over and over again. Now, how do you account for that? Because it doesn't seem that cultural diffusion is going to account for all of those things. And the book, I don't know if you're familiar with this, Joseph Campbell wrote a book, and this is one of the reasons I deal with hero myth so much in my class, is because he wrote this one book called The Hero of a Thousand Faces, where he says that, all these myths, all these heroes that you see from every culture in the world is really just the same story. It's a concept that he calls the monomyth, right? The one story. And when you start to look at these things, and it includes stories we see today. I mean, you can pick out a movie, like you mentioned, Justice League. I haven't seen the Justice League, but one of the stories that I cover in my mythology class with my students, a film that I have them watch, is Batman Begins, or the Harry Potter movies. All these movies, modern stories, ancient stories, medieval stories, doesn't matter when they happen, they follow certain set patterns. And this pattern has been analyzed. And Jung comes along and says, why is it that we have these patterns? And he didn't just recognize the patterns in stories, but he recognized the patterns also in people's dreams. I mean, Freud and Jung, they did a lot of analysis with their patients, dream interpretation. And you see the same things manifest in the dream world and in the stories that human cultures tell. And he believed this has something to do with something inherent in the psyche, which he calls the archetypes. Now, that's something that I started getting interested in as a way to explain parallel mythology, but I wanted to look at it more from a perspective of kind of a moderate realist, scholastic position. Mm-hmm. Jung tends to be a little bit Platonic. I don't know if you're familiar much with the archetypal theory, but for him, and stop me if this isn't something you want to go down this rabbit hole. The archetypes are these inherited structures. You can call them also instinctive structures in the human psyche that exert influence on our psychological development or emotional development. They manifest their presence in different ways, including in the images that they generate. And these images would then be the types of things that are combined into various motifs that we see in stories all over the world. They are going to also possibly explain, religious experience, right? Because if you've studied world religions, you know that there are certain stock religious motifs and symbols that are kind of transcultural. And I think one of the neat things about his, collective unconscious idea, besides the fact that it posits some kind of universal human nature, which fits very well in the scholastic tradition, but it also, now I lost my thought. Where was I going?
It happens to me all the time.
Yeah, I do that in all my lectures and my classes. Accounts for the fact that you have these transcultural ideas. Okay, mm-hmm. So there's nothing absolutely unique to any one culture. Now, of course, every culture has got different ways that they modify these stories, right? You've got your unique situation, your unique locality, your unique traditions, and myth, he would say, is basically a modified expression of what's going on in the human psyche. So anyways, let me get back around to kind of how these things might operate and how you might be able to look at it from maybe a different perspective. Mm-hmm. So again, we've got these standard stories, these standard motifs, and he's Platonic in the sense that, these are ideas. If you've studied Plato, he talks about the forms, the ideas that exist in the Platonic realm. And Jung even comes across very Platonic when he says things like, you've got this archetype, like the father archetype. And we don't know a father based merely on our experience of a father in our lives, but we know what a father is based on the archetype when, our experience kind of matches that. It reminds you maybe of the, recollection theory, Plato's theory of recollection, the idea that you, know a tree because it's a reflection of this, Platonic perfect tree up in the, realm of forms. So he's very Platonic in that sense. Of course, you don't need to have that kind of model. Like I said, if you take more of the Aristotelian approach or the scholastic approach, you're going to have to reverse a few things, but Jung's not concerned with, where these ideas come from, or rather, I should say, where these archetypes come from. He just posits it as a way to explain the things that he's dealing with, right? He says the only proof of his theory of archetypes ultimately is that it's applicable, right? All right, so it's right. How would you actually prove a scientific hypothesis anyways? I mean, you can disprove it. There's a falsification process, but he doesn't really have a proof for it, but he sees it as applicable. Now, he comes up with the theory. I think he does acknowledge the fact that there are guys that talked about archetypes in the ancient world. Now, Plato doesn't use the word, I think, archetype directly. He talks about the eidos, right? The idea. Augustine is probably the first person to really take that concept of the forms of Plato or Plotinus and put them into the mind of God. And that's something that Thomas Aquinas is going to pick up on later, right? Augustine's a huge influence on Aquinas. But, you go back to Philo, and Philo talks about the archetypes when he talks about the imago Dei in man, right? That's what he calls the archetype, right? The image of God in mankind. Irenaeus himself uses the term as well, and he uses it for the things that God looks at as he creates the world, right? So models for creation. That's a little bit more along the lines of what you might find in the scholastic tradition. So Jung has some interesting insight, right? The collective unconscious, links up really well, like I said, with the idea of a universal human nature. I think it does a good job there in being able to account for why you have these stories, right, all around the world, similarities of religious experience. But it's also, I think, helpful for maybe Christians to look at the issue from that point of view too, only because you realize that, as God interjects himself into human history, right, in the incarnation, it comes down with a goal in mind, right, to redeem mankind and to bring them back into a relationship with himself through the death and resurrection of Christ. That story, more or less, right, and again, I already mentioned that the stories that are posited as parallels for the story of Jesus are very different from the story of Jesus, which I think is one of the reasons you could say copying probably didn't occur. The stories have similarities, but it's not that direct. But the fact that these other cultures have stories that deal with death and rebirth, that they have stories that deal with man's deepest concerns. I mean, death, the meaning of life, the development of us, as we mature. Matter of fact, you can think of death in a lot of these stories really as a metaphor for this idea of putting, the past person away. I mean, as we grow and mature, right? Even in Christianity, we talk about the baptism as dying with Christ and rising again, so that we die to the old man and, have this new life and this new person that's redeemed. So, you could use the term metaphorically. Of course, literally, you have this idea that Jesus provides eternal life for us as well. But this is a huge concern for all cultures, all people, all times. So it's not surprising that all cultures, all people, all times have those stories, are addressing these topics, because that's what mythology is. It's a way that you can investigate the biggest and deepest concerns of human beings through narrative, right? And it's not surprising that the Bible actually uses narrative to communicate to us, because narrative is something that resonates with us. It's why we like to go to the movies. It's why we like to read books. Okay, so I think Jung's really useful there. But the other aspect of Jung's archetypal theory that's also very interesting is that he says the archetypes have a function, right? They're there to help the process of individuation. They actually have like an end, right? Which this whole idea of intentionality, end directedness, final causes, it's not something that you'd think, a modern social scientist or a scientist would have any room for. Right. I mean, the idea of final causes has been kicked out of the realm of science, right, for centuries. So, but if you want, we can talk a little bit about kind of maybe a scholastic or Thomistic approach to that whole idea, because I think there is another way that you can account for those types of patterns in human thought, and you don't have to resort to necessarily a Jungian perspective.
Yeah. No, absolutely. As for our listeners and viewers, If you don't know, SES is very Thomistic in its philosophy. Obviously, we have some theological disagreements, here and there. But I will say, when Aquinas was a Catholic, everybody was a Catholic. There really wasn't anything else. But there nevertheless are some theological differences. But we're Thomistic in the sense of our foundational philosophy. So yes, I would love to hear how you apply that kind of thinking to this particular issue.
Okay. Now, I've given it some thought, but it's kind of still a process in mind. But Aquinas, being an Aristotelian, obviously is going to differ from Plato. He doesn't believe in, innate ideas. Obviously, all of our knowledge begins in the senses, right? Now, metaphysically speaking, he does have room for archetypes because he talks about the rationes, the divine ideas, again, relying a little bit on Augustine and some of the people that preceded him. Now, when he talks about the divine ideas, which are in God, you could think of them, and a good book, by the way, that would cover some of this stuff, if I can recall the title, because it's been years since I've read it. Gregory Doolin was the author. I think it's called Aquinas on the Divine Ideas, or something like that. And he addresses, the Aquinas' view of ideas as exemplar causes, right? The divine ideas are models, I guess you could say. And what they are specifically would be the divine essence, right? The simple, God, of course, in the Thomistic sense is simple, right? He's not a complex being. He's not compound. He's pure act. And the divine ideas are that divine essence as imitable in other things, okay? So you got a diversity of divine ideas that God uses as exemplars for the creation that he makes, which is an interesting idea because everything that is made, being made after these divine ideas, and these divine ideas being the divine essence as imitable, means that everything that is created is in some sense a reflection of the nature of God. So we talk about, general revelation, doing natural theology. This is kind of the basis of it, right? It's the way that God has actually created the world, right? It's a metaphysical explanation for why things are the way they are. Now, on our end, of course, we begin our understanding of God through our interaction with the world around us, right? So when we approach the substance, right, that we see in front of us, you have this process where the form of the thing, right, is taken into the human cognition, this process of abstraction, right? And what we end up with is a universal form. And again, not to get into the whole details about, abstraction, but you've got, the form matter unity, the hylomorphism, and maybe I'm going to start getting a little bit too confusing here if I go too far down this road. But everything that God created is a combination, right, of form and matter, right? And when we look at something that is a form matter composite, what we do as we abstract is we pull the form away from the matter and comes to exist in us cognitionally, right? We have this cognitional being. So it's the same form and it's universal. It's in a sense then, it becomes an extrinsic form, right? We think of the form as intrinsic within the substance, but when we hold it in our minds, it's extrinsic. It's pulled away from that substance. And that's the same thing that the divine idea is in the mind of God. It's an extrinsic form, and it's an intrinsic formal cause of all that exists. All right. So in our interaction with reality, we actually pull in these different forms that exist now in us. Mm-hmm. So Jung doesn't really talk about where the archetypes come from, right? They're just these unrepresentable instinctive structures that can generate images. But if you take a Thomistic approach, you could see how these ideas, how these archetypes actually come to reside within the human psyche. And it's through this process that kind of built into reality in the way that we engage as knowers. Okay, right? Knowing is a metaphysical event. And I think the really interesting thing that makes Aquinas's metaphysics and kind of a scholastic approach superior to a Jungian approach. First of all, is like I said, Jung says the only proof of his theory is its applicability, because he's trying to bring up a theory or come up with a theory that's going to account for what he's looking for, similarities between dreams and similarities between stories and religious experiences. So it's in that sense kind of an ad hoc hypothesis, right? He's trying to come up with something that's going to address a particular problem. As far as I know, and I'm pretty sure of this, Aquinas wasn't trying to explain parallel mythology. He wasn't trying to explain those types of things. His metaphysics actually, goes all the way back to Aristotle, talking like, 2,300 years ago, and is a much tighter system. I mean, it relates everything from just not only metaphysical concepts, but to ethics and politics, and the whole system that was developed among the classical philosophers is tight. It wasn't directed towards explaining parallel mythology, yet it does help us explain parallel mythology, which is why I think it's such a useful metaphysic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think you hit on something that for me is probably my favorite thing about SES, having gone through the program and knowing nothing about scholastic philosophy or Thomas Aquinas or any of that, coming in, but coming out on the other side, seeing this systematic way of thinking about reality as a whole, whether that's mythology, whether that's the tree outside my window, whether that's God, or whatever we're thinking about. We have this systematic way of thinking well about reality, and it literally influences every single thing we do, including our biblical interpretation, hermeneutics, all of those things. And I think that's what we're missing so much in the church as a whole. We've compartmentalized so much of our thinking and adopted so many of these modern ways of thinking and abandoned this more scholastic approach. And it's just chopped up our thinking into these little unrelated bits of information that we think we know. And then we try to solve all these problems that result from that. And as Dr. Howe, our mutual friend, says, those problems don't really exist. You invented those problems because you're thinking poorly to begin with. So that's interesting to see how you're applying that to this particular issue. So I think that's quite fascinating. Would you say that, back to our fallacy of the week that we started the show with, is there a lot of confirmation bias going on with some of these folks theorizing about Christianity copying these myths and whatever piece of information you're going to give them? See, I told you they're just copying from Mithras, or they're copying from Osiris, or whatever.
Yeah, I think there is. I mean, it's clear that people do have confirmation bias. I get responses to some of my videos. I got a video on my YouTube channel on the Mithraic cult. It's a talk that I gave actually years and years ago at the Apologetics Conference. And, I'll still, to this day, I probably have more views on that video than any other video on my channel. And, it's almost like they don't listen to the case that I'm trying to present and just say, oh, well, he's a Christian, he's biased, he's, trying to promote Christianity and, disparage Mithraism. It's clear that, it's a copy. So they're stuck in their set view, their perspective. And it's, obviously I'm biased as well. I try to be as conscious of my bias as I possibly can. I'm aware that that talk in particular is defending Christianity against these accusations. But I do try to explain it and make an argument, right? It's not just, pure bias that's being presented. So I think we all have to be aware of our bias, and I mean, that's natural, but I do think, confirmation bias is hard to get around. Mm-hmm. We're also guilty of it on various occasions.
Yeah. And, I appreciate, Dr. Tom Howe. We just mentioned Dr. Richard Howe, but the work that Dr. Tom Howe, Richard's brother, has done in the area of objectivity, and that, we can admit that we all have a tendency to be biased to one degree or another, but we don't have to remove that completely in order to have objective knowledge about a subject. Right. Because as you've just illustrated, there is this universal human nature and these truths about reality that are true for all people in all places at all times, regardless of your culture, that provides the common ground from which we're able to have these types of conversations and argue about our biases and examine evidence and all these sorts of things. So I do want to point out for our listeners and our viewers, If you want just to go one level deeper in what we're talking about, just to get a little more taste, if you visit ses.edu, click on the media link, you can download our free ebook, Why Trust the God of the Bible. And essentially, it's our just general apologetics case in a very nutshell version. But it gets into some of these issues that Alan's brought up with form and matter and act and potency and all of these sorts of things, and how those issues influence our thinking about the existence of God, interpretation of the Bible, worldview, bias, all this sort of stuff. It's covered, again, just in a nutshell version in that little ebook, Why Trust the God of the Bible. So you can get that at ses.edu. So, Alan, in our last bit together, I want to move into our Q&A segment. Let me try that again. Easy for me to say.
Okay.
And we always say, we do the On the Contrary segment, and then we have an I Answer That segment. And, of course, that's in honor of Thomas Aquinas and the way that he structured many of his writings. So I'm going to move in quickly to our segment, I Answer That.
Okay.
So you mentioned earlier in the show, your book, The Mithraic Origins of Christianity, of course, just deals with the Mithras cult. Would that be considered a mystery religion? Is that classified as one of those?
Yeah,
Okay.
generally under the category of like a Hellenistic mystery cult.
Okay.
Though it's
Okay.
more of a Roman era,
Gotcha.
first century cult and on. So.
Yep. So, of course, in your book, you're just dealing with that specifically, but you mentioned Osiris and some of these other pagan gods with a little g that are often brought up in these types of copycat religion conversations. So what about those other claims of Osiris, and I forget the other names off the top of my head right now, but there are multiple ones that people bring up. So how do we deal with some of those, just on the surface at least?
I'd say on the same way. Osiris obviously was a god, and this is a very old story, right? I mean, it's definitely predates the Bible, but he's a god that dies. He's actually cut up into a number of pieces by Set and versions of the story, and he's reassembled. Most of him is reassembled and brought back to life by his wife Isis temporarily, but ultimately he ends up being the judge of the underworld, the god of the dead. So it's not a physical resurrection. Of course, all these stories, whether it's, Dionysus, who is often presented as a dying and rising god, and, there are times when he has gone into Hades and come back. And that's the same type of thing that you get in the stories of most of the heroes, like Heracles. He descends into Hades and he comes back after his quest. Aeneas, the same type of thing. So they're not necessarily dying and then rising again. Mm-hmm. So there are, deaths for many of these characters as well. But again, the parallels are fairly general, right? So none of these characters is presented, well, maybe I should say, with the exception of some of the hero stories, is presented as a historical figure in a realistic sense. I mean, Jesus, this historical period, there are plenty of cases that can be made of the historicity of Jesus and the text and evidence that we have for that. But I think you can deal with it the same way. I mean, where there are parallels because human beings have a particular group of concerns that they're wrestling with. And there's certain ways our stories generally tend to emerge. And that's one of the ways that you can account for these parallels and like basically this type of stuff that we were talking about earlier on. And though it's not completely fleshed out, we didn't have a lot of time to lay it out in a really systematic fashion. And that's partly my fault. Kind of just rambling as I'm talking. But when you end up investigating these particular stories, specific stories, you'll actually see that the parallels are not that close, right? None of them have a physical resurrection the same way that we're talking about Christ. It's just, you read the stories and you'll immediately see, yeah, there's some similarities, but, right? Very few, if any of these characters have what we could really call a virgin birth. None of them were really figures that walked around, teaching the kingdom of God or anything like that. So Jesus is really, really unique. So.
Yeah, and of course, back to that systematic way of thinking about reality. That's why we teach apologetics the way we do at SES, and Dr. Geisler's 12 points approach, and that first you're establishing truth, the truth about reality is knowable, and then you're establishing the existence of the theistic God, a very specific God with a very specific worldview, so to speak, for lack of a better word, that gives you the preconditions for something like Jesus existing and claiming to be the Son of God and doing miracles and all of these sorts of things. And you don't have those kind of worldviews in these other pagan types of religions. I'm just thinking if someone was to say, we have a Jesus doing miracles and obviously it's a fairy tale and it's myth because those things aren't possible. In an atheistic universe, that's right.
Yeah. Right. Supernatural bias, anti-supernatural bias.
That's right. That's right. So that's again why we do this systematic approach to thinking
from the ground up.
That's right. Thinking through these issues. What are some of the other common questions or accusations or objections that you get around this copycat idea?
Tell you the truth, there aren't that many original objections. They seem to be the same ones over and over again, which is why, like you said, when you watch Zeitgeist or Religulous, it's going to be the same list. Mm-hmm. There's memes. I mean, you can find all kinds of things on the internet, and it's all the same thing. So nothing unusual or new or nothing that can't be answered or hasn't been answered.
Mm-hmm. Is there one you think is maybe the most challenging to deal with?
Probably just a dying and rising God parallels. I mean, that seems to be the biggest. And again, like I said, a lot of apologists are going to dismiss the parallels altogether. I've heard that for years. Mm-hmm. I was never satisfied with it because I knew the stories probably a little bit better than they did.
Right.
So that's where the challenge is. I mean, you could take that approach and it's going to fail because somebody's going to be able to bring out the story and show you what parallels they're talking about. But I think you have to handle it a different way. Yeah. And that's what I've been trying to do,
right.
When I deal with it.
I appreciate that. And I can't remember if we've covered straw man yet or not as the fallacy of the week, but we will if we haven't. But, that's one thing I love about Aquinas' writings is he would always present arguments against his case first before he presented his case. And he would steel man those arguments. He would not straw man those. Yeah, he would give the hardest case that he could think of against his view and then go back and answer each of those arguments. So I know what's that? I'm sorry.
And tear it apart pretty well.
And tear it apart, exactly. And I know just for me personally, as an apologist, that is something very easy to struggle with is just straw manning a particular position just because it's easier to answer or quicker to answer, and we need to be careful with that.
That's one of the problems with the media culture that we have. You don't usually have the time to give a well thought out, lengthy response. It's all kind of sound bites, and it's easier to make some kind of quick objection because the response is going to take book length dissertation to answer. So.
Right. And sadly, our theology has become the same kind of soundbite bumper sticker theology as well. And then we wonder why we're in the state that we're in as a church and as a culture. Now I've lost my train of thought. There was one other question that I was going to ask you. Oh, I know what it was. So I think we've hinted at this, but I think I remember Dr. Geisler writing about this specifically, in that maybe not with Osiris in particular, but with a lot of these. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you've mentioned that. Oftentimes the stories post-date Christianity. The Christianity was actually earlier than the supposed myths that Christianity is copying from. So can you explain that just a little bit?
Yeah, and that's where I think Mithras comes in, like my book. Mm-hmm. The cult form, the Mithraic cult, really originates, and most scholars today are on this page as well, in the late 1st century at the earliest, and then becomes really popular 2nd century through like the 4th century. It's like its peak, which is obviously after the Christian church had begun and the New Testament was essentially written down. So they couldn't have had, or that one at least couldn't have had an impact. Of course, the God predates Christianity by thousands of years. So we do have references to Mithras and Persia in various places. So it depends what story you're specifically talking about. There is definitely a reaction to Christianity that we can see in the mystery cults in the 2nd, 3rd, 4th centuries AD, where they do seem to synthesize somewhat. They were distinct cults earlier on, but a lot of them did predate Christianity, like the cult of Isis, the cult of Cybele, the cult of Attis, and especially the Greek cults, like the Orphic cult, the Bacchic cult, and the Eleusinian cult. Those are all things that, at least the Greek ones, can go back to at least the 6th century BC. So some of the myths and stories do predate Christianity. I don't think that's necessarily the case across the board, but some of the similarities start to become more profound as we get into that formative era of the early Christian church. And I know there's a lot of back and forth between the church fathers and a lot of the pagan writers and philosophers. So I think some of that takes place there. But I wouldn't say that you could just say all these stories post-state Christianity, because that's not true.
Right. Again, we want to be accurate and not straw man the argument. So thanks for clearing that up. So if you could leave our viewers and our listeners just with one thought, maybe they're still struggling with some of this and still concerned, what would you leave them with?
I guess I would say that you shouldn't be afraid of pagan mythology, that the accusations of copying that seem to be a challenge to your faith, it might be a better way to think about these things. And again, take your time and do think about these things, and don't just, dismiss your faith offhand. But realize if there are these patterns in human thought, and if God has created us in a certain way to engage with reality, and that's the reason that you have these kind of transcultural symbols and archetypal images and ideas and motifs and stories all around the globe, then that might very well just be part of God's plan to reveal himself in his general revelation, right? I mean, there's a reason that the gospel message ultimately is transcultural. All right. Every culture that hears the gospel for the first time is going to resonate with them because they already have similar stories in their own traditions. And I think that's part of the brilliance of God, as if we're giving him a compliment. Like he's a smart guy. Yeah, you know what I'm talking about. But that might be what I'd say.
Yeah. No, I think that's a great thought. I think it was Dr. Geisler who just made this little analogy that I thought was clever and helped me was. The fact that there were movies about people going to space prior, or Star Trek or whatever, prior to the space program and us actually landing on the moon, did not mean that we didn't actually land on the moon and that we haven't been to space, simply because there were fictitious stories that predated the actual events. Is it Ecclesiastes that God has set eternity in our hearts, in the hearts of men? I think it's Ecclesiastes. I can't remember. It's in there somewhere.
Yes, I've heard it.
Yes. So yeah, I totally agree with you that this is actually not confirmation bias. That this is really strong evidence of this human nature that longs for something more. And given the other evidence that we have for Christianity, points to the truthfulness of the claims of the gospel and of the Christian faith. So, Alan, where can folks find out more about you and get your book? Again, the book is The Mithraic Origins of Christianity, Questioning the Mithras-Christ Connection.
Yeah, you can find that on Amazon. It's pretty easy to look that one up. Also, my YouTube channel is just Alan DiDonato. Got a lot of, actually, my lectures for mythology class, humanities, ancient medieval humanities, and a lot of my stuff is over there, including some apologetic stuff. So that's one place you can check me out.
Awesome. It's alandidonato.com?
No, it's just a YouTube channel. It's just Alan DiDonato.
YouTube channel. Okay.
Yeah.
So search that on YouTube. And again, DiDonato is DiDonato for folks listening on the podcast.
Capital DONATO. Yeah.
There you go.
Well, you have it spelled on the screen.
Awesome.
Perfect.
Well, Alan, I really appreciate your time. It's been a fascinating discussion, and thanks for all the work you're doing.
Oh, you're welcome. This has been fun. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. Look forward to doing it again.
All right. Take care.
Well, I hope you found that helpful, and I found it very fascinating. There's so many issues to think through that are often deeper than we may think they are at times, but also not as scary as we may think they are at times. So I hope you'll check out Alan's book, The Mithraic Origins of Christianity, Questioning the Mithras-Christ Connection. And as always, if you're interested in learning more about becoming a student at SES, whether that's in a degree program, a certificate program, or even just auditing classes, visit degrees.ses.edu/podcast. That's degrees.ses.edu/podcast. You can download a free ebook, 3 Reasons Why a Seminary Education May Be Right for You. Learn a little bit more about what makes SES a unique educational opportunity and choice for you. And of course, we can't do this on our own without the support of folks like you. So visit ses.edu to learn more about how you can partner with us, either financially, prayerfully, whatever that may look like for you. Thank you again for joining us. We will be talking about, I think, the resurrection next week as we're coming up on Easter. So be on the lookout for that. And as always, we call this show Why Do You Believe? And the only reason to believe anything is because it's true. So go share truth with someone today.
Providing an integrated approach to theology, philosophy, and apologetics that will equip you to proclaim the gospel, engage the culture, and defend the truth. That's SES.